Elira never remembered the first time she saw Callan. Not with clarity, not in the way one remembers first snow or first blood. He had always seemed to be there, like the river, like the sound of the blacksmith's hammer echoing in the early hours, a steady part of the world that made no demand for attention until, suddenly, it did. The lavender hills rose just beyond the edge of the village, a sloping curve of wild, purple-blooming silence, where goats graze and children once dare each other to sleep beneath the stars. It was there, under the mottled shade of an old rowan tree, that she truly saw him. He was 16 then, just a boy growing into the weight of his father's tools, with soot-stained hands and the kind of silence that felt watchful rather than shy. Elira had climbed the tree to escape her younger brother's tantrum, and he had simply appeared beneath her, as if drawn by some invisible thread of fate or folly. He looked up, squinted against the sun, and offered no greeting, only a slight nod, as though acknowledging that something unnamed had shifted between them. In the years that followed, they met often, but never by design. The village was small, the fields fewer still, and the routines of rural life left little room for artifice. She saw him at the well at the harvest, passing by with a wagon of horseshoes or carrying flour to the baker. He did not speak much then, but his silences grew comfortable, familiar. They were the kind of silences that asked nothing and gave something back, a steadiness, a nearness. She found herself noticing things she hadn't before. The scar just above his left brow, a pale thread like the seam of some old story. The way he turned his hands inward when nervous, thumbs brushing the web between his fingers. The way he looked at the horizon, not like someone dreaming of elsewhere, but someone measuring how long he had left to stay. It was not until her 18th summer, the one where the clouds seemed permanently bruised and the river swelled over their banks, that they first kissed. The war had not yet reached them, but it crept like fog into conversation, into the eyes of mothers at the market, into the way her father coughed over his porridge when her brother asked about enlistment. There were whispers, of course, talk of territories and borders and boys not returning. But the hills remained untouched, and so did they, for a while. That day, they'd spent hours beneath the rowan tree. Elira lay with her back pressed into the damp grass, eyes half-lidded, voice drifting between stories about her mother's youth and the names of flowers her grandmother once taught her. Callan sat beside her, knees pulled to his chest, hands rough and stained with cold dust. He listened. That was what he always did best. When she turned to him, her braid unraveling over her shoulder, she saw the faint tremble in his jaw before he leaned in and kissed her. It was a brief thing, not dramatic or breathless, but it settled deep, like a stone dropped into still water. They made a habit of the hills after that. It became their place, though they never called it that. She would bring a book, sometimes bread, and he would bring pieces of what he carved into birds or boxes, or nothing at all. They didn't speak about love, not in those words, but it clung to them nonetheless. In the way she rested her head on his thigh as he whittled, in the way he watched her fingers trace the edge of his coat without pulling away. The lavender trees bloomed tall that year, heavy with scent, and Elira tied a red ribbon to one of the lower branches, a quiet mark of belonging. She didn't tell him what it meant. Not then, but she thought he knew. There was a kind of sacredness to it, an unspoken promise that this place, this time, would wait for them. The war came to the village not with gunfire or smoke, but with the sound of boots on gravel and names read aloud. Callan's name came third. Elira stood in the square as the constable read it, her fingers gripping the hem of her apron so tightly her knuckles turned white. She did not cry then, not when he came to say goodbye 2 days later, not when he handed her a small wooden swallow with her initials carved on its wing, not even when he kissed her with urgency for the first time and whispered her name like a tether. She held it all inside. When he left, the ribbon fluttered alone in the wind, and she returned to it often, pressing her palm to the bark of the tree where they had first kissed, where she had first known that loving someone could feel like both a bloom and a bruise. The weeks after his departure moved slowly, as though time itself had entered mourning. Elira took over more duties at home, baking in the early hours, tending to the garden, scrubbing linen until her hands cracked. Her mother, whose health had begun its slow decline, spoke little, and her father seemed to shrink into his chair by the hearth, a man carved out by worry. The village felt quieter, its edges dulled by absence. Boys who had once chased chickens down the lane were now gone, replaced by letters that came stained and creased, or worse, no letters at all. Still, Alira waited. She wrote to Callan weekly, careful letters filled with small details. The first snow, the scent of apples in the cellar, the new goat born with a white patch like a star on its forehead. She tied each one with twine and handed them to the postman with a soft prayer folded between her fingers. Seasons turned. The ribbon faded to a pale, weather-beaten pink. Her letters went unanswered. Whispers began to seep in, of battles gone wrong, of regiments decimated, of names that no longer returned from the roll calls. She refused to listen. She could not afford to. Each morning she returned to the hills, sat beneath the tree, closed her eyes, and tried to remember the weight of his hand over hers, the low sound of his laughter when she mispronounced the Latin names of plants, the press of his lips on her temple the day before he left. Memory became her only tether, and even that began to fray. On the anniversary of his departure, she returned to the grove and found the ribbon torn loose, caught in the bramble beneath the tree. She stood there for a long while, holding in her hands, the fabric limp and sun-bleached, no longer red but some faded echo of it. She did not cry. She rarely did. Instead, she sat down and traced the dirt with her finger, drawing the shape of the swallow he had carved, remembering the feel of its wings against her palm. She pressed the ribbon to her lips and whispered his name, once, into the wind. It did not answer. It was the first time she allowed herself to consider he might not return. But even then, she did not let go. She planted lavender along the edge of the cottage that spring, filling the air with its quiet perfume, a silent vigil to the boy who kissed her under a tree and promised nothing but presents. In the evenings, when the sky bruised with dusk, she would stand at the window and look toward the hills, toward the place where they had once carved a space for themselves, where the earth still remembered them even if the world did not. Love, she learned, was not only in the staying. Sometimes it was in the waiting, and sometimes it was in the ache that never left. It was during the late winter of Alira's 20th year that the letter came. The ground was still hard with frost, the air sharp with the clean, bitter smell of wood smoke and iron. Morning light had not yet fully reached the windows when she heard the knock. Soft, uncertain, like the hand behind it questioned whether it should disturb the silence within. Her mother was already coughing in the bedroom, a deep, wet sound that scraped to the walls, and her father had not risen yet. Alira wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door to find a boy no older than 15, cheeks wind-burnt, boots crusted with half-frozen mud. He didn't look her in the eyes, just held out the letter with a hand that trembled too much for the cold alone. Then he left without a word, walking stiffly down the path like someone carrying something far heavier than paper. The envelope bore the seal of the Royal Infantry. The name was written in ink that had run in the corners, blurred where damp or time had touched it. Her fingers paused just above the flap, unsure whether to tear it open or drop it into the fire. She read it standing in the doorway, the morning light widening slowly behind her, illuminating the ink as though truth needed witness. The language was clinical, distant, regretfully, presumed dead, missing in action during engagement near the Redwater Plains. No body recovered. Alira read it twice before her knees folded beneath her. She did not scream. She did not faint. She simply lowered herself to the threshold, the paper clutched in her hand, and stared at the cold stone beneath her as if it might rise and tell her this was some mistake. Inside, her mother called out softly, asking if it was snowing yet. Alira folded the letter with careful hands and placed it on the table. She lit the stove and boiled water for tea. She carried a damp cloth into the bedroom and pressed it gently to her mother's forehead. She stirred the soup on the hearth and salted it just enough to dull the taste of ash in her mouth. Grief did not come in a single blow. It seeped in quietly, a slow unraveling, like the fray of a hem worn thin by time and touch. In those first days, she did not cry. Not because she didn't want to, but because the tears would not come. Her body refused it, as if denying sorrow could reverse the fact of it. The village whispered around her. People spoke in lowered tones when she passed, their eyes soft with pity or curiosity or both. The baker gave her extra bread without asking. The seamstress offered fabric from her private stash. At first, she accepted these kindnesses with numb hands, not knowing how to refuse. But over time, the charity began to weigh on her like a second grief. Pity had a way of erasing a person, making them into a figure instead of a name. She was no longer Alira, daughter of Maeve and Darren, keeper bees, lover of the hills. She became the girl who lost the blacksmith's boy, the girl who didn't wear black because there was no grave to mark, the girl who waited too long. Each morning she awoke before the sky warmed and pressed her fingers to the window pane, checking for frost. She measured the world by small rituals. The way the kettle sighed when it boiled, the sound of the axe splitting wood in the yard, the time it took for her mother's cough to begin each day. There was comfort in repetition, in tasks that asked only for her hands and not for heart. She scrubbed floors until her knuckles bled, planted onions and turnips in the still cold soil, stitched pillowcases from scraps, and did not speak his name. But grief, she found, does not stay obediently in the heart. It settles into the marrow, into the spaces behind the eyes and beneath the fingernails. It moves with quiet cunning, finding her in the strangest places, inside the handle of the pot he once admired, in the creak of the barn door that had echoed with his laughter, in the shadows that fell across the lavender grove when dusk arrived and she stood too long at the window. One afternoon, she returned to the tree where the ribbon once hung. The branch had snapped in a windstorm weeks ago, and the bark was torn where it had split. She knelt there and placed a stone at the base, a marker to nothing, and whispered goodbye without speaking aloud. Months passed, and life continued in its unyielding way. Her mother's health declined further, a slow retreat into breathlessness and bone. Alira bathed her gently, fed her broth with careful hands, sang to her in the old language her grandmother used to sing. Her father grew more silent, his eyes flickering off into the hills, as if expecting something or someone to return. Alira worked without complaint, not because she didn't feel sorrow, but because sorrow had become the air itself. She learned to breathe through it. Then came the dreams. They began softly. Hints of Callan's voice in the wind, a figure standing just out of reach in the field. She dismissed them as memory, echoes of hope refusing to die cleanly. But soon the dreams grew sharper, more insistent. She dreamt of him walking barefoot across snow, eyes hollow, mouth stitched shut. She dreamt of battlefields soaked in lavender instead of blood, where he stood surrounded by faceless soldiers, arms outstretched but unable to touch her. In the waking hours, the dreams clung to her, a shadow at her heels. She began writing letters to him again, though she knew no one would read them. She wrote them late at night, by the fire, careful script folded neatly and placed beneath the hearthstone in a hollow where mice once nested. Each letter began the same way. If you are still alive, I need you to come home. She never spoke of these letters to anyone. In public, she maintained her quiet resilience. She baked the bread, sold eggs, smiled when spoken to, but inside, a loneliness took root, so deep it no longer had a name. She stopped going to the hills, stopped gathering lavender. The red ribbon was gone. The tree bore no flowers that year. Spring came slow, and when it did, the blooms were pale, sparse. Some said it was the soil, others blamed the cold. Alira said nothing. She knew loss could touch even the roots. When her mother died in late autumn, Alira buried her behind the cottage, near the elder tree where birds nested. She marked the grave with a flat stone and a braid of dried rosemary. The funeral was small, just neighbors and a priest who stuttered over her name. Her father spoke only once that day, pressing a hand to her shoulder and whispering, "She's with the others now." He never said who the others were, but Alira thought she understood, the ones who left and did not return. After the funeral, she sat beside the fire and pulled one of the letters from beneath the hearthstone. It was the first one she had written. Creased and smoke-scented, the ink faded in places. She read it again, not as a message to Callan, but as a memory of herself, of the girl who still believed in return. She stared into fire for a long while, then reached for another piece of parchment. She did not write this one as a plea. She wrote it as a confession. "I don't know how to forget you," she wrote. "I don't know if I want to." When she lifted the hearthstone to place it with the others, one letter was missing. At first, she thought a mistake. She searched the surrounding floor, checked the edges of the hearth, even the corners of the chimney, but the letter was gone. The one she had written 3 weeks earlier, the one where she had told him about the dying lavender, about the dream where he reached for her and vanished. That one was missing. She stood still for a long time, listening for the creak of wind, the scuttle of mice, the tick of the old clock on the mantel. Nothing moved, and yet something had shifted. She didn't tell her father, didn't mention it to the priest when he came for tea the next day. But that night, as the fire dimmed and the world narrowed into shadows, she stood at the window and stared toward the hills, her breath fogging the glass. A feeling stirred in her. Not hope, not yet, but something quieter. A flicker, a pause in the silence. Like the space between two heartbeats when the world waits to know if love can still live where death once ruled. By the time Alira turned 21, she had forgotten how to speak of love without feeling its absence first. It was no longer a presence in her life, but shape left behind, an outline burned gently into the edges of her memory. People in the village had stopped mentioning Callan by name. The polite ones avoided the subject altogether, while others, less careful, more restless, offered vague encouragements or suggestions that she consider moving on. The war had taken too many boys to expect any of them back, and Alira, despite her silence, became a symbol of someone who waited too long and asked too little. She did not argue. What could she say that would not hollow out her voice? Grief had changed her, not in a way that was visible from a distance, but in the small, unremarkable details. Her pauses before answering, the way she looked out the window too long before returning to a conversation, the quiet folding of her hands when someone asked if she was lonely. She had not wept for Callan, not in the full, crumbling way that others expected. The tears, when they came, arrived silently, sometimes in the late hours of night, sometimes while rinsing a pot or kneading dough. They were like rain through a leaking roof, unexpected, slow, never enough to drown but always enough to stain. Her father noticed a change in her, but did not speak of it. He had aged too, his beard grayer, his steps slower, his eyes more often focused on the fire than the horizon. Since her mother's burial, their conversations had become fewer, confined mostly to the needs of the farm and the small, practical matters of living. Neither of them wanted to disturb the fragile quiet that had settled between them, like dust on a long-unused book, not unpleasant but thick with weight. The cottage, too, had changed in character. It bore the feeling of a space slowly being absorbed by its own history. Alira cleaned it daily, but even she could not keep the sense of stillness from seeping into the walls. The wooden beams groaned in the evening. The hearth crackled but gave off less heat than it once had, and the corners seemed darker even in daylight. She spent more time alone now, often working the garden until her back ached or reading by the fire with one of her mother's old shawls pulled over her shoulders. When the weather allowed, she walked into the fields, gathering herbs and wildflowers, mostly out of habit. She rarely brought them back inside. Instead, she left small bundles on the edge of the grove where the lavender trees still stood, a quiet tribute to a part of herself she had stopped speaking to aloud. It was during one of these quiet afternoons in late spring, while collecting thyme and marigold for drying, that she felt the ache more sharply than usual. Not a pain, exactly, but a kind of trembling in her ribs, as if something unnamed had shifted just beneath the surface. She sat beside the elder tree at the border of the property, running her fingers over the roots, and realized she had not spoken Callan's name in over a year. Not aloud, not even in prayer. It startled her, this realization, that the name itself had become something buried, something she feared might not rise if called. She whispered it then, almost experimentally. Callan. The sound of it in her mouth made her close her eyes. It felt like tasting honey after a year of salt. Familiar, sweet, almost painful. That night, she returned to hearth and pulled out the small tin box where she kept the letters, the ones she had written after the news of his death, folded and hidden beneath the stone floor, out of reach but never out of thought. She had not opened them since placing them there. The ink might have faded, the words might have been nonsense now, but they were hers, pieces of a self she no longer wore. She lit a candle and unfolded the first letter with careful hands. The parchment was brittle at the corners, but the words remained. Her handwriting, uneven with grief, filled the page. She read it in silence, each line drawing breath back into old wounds. I dream of you standing in a lavender grove, your hands covered in ash. I try to remember your voice, but it always comes back like water through cloth. I don't know how to keep you with me when the world keeps moving without you. She read every letter that night, all 12. Some were hopeful, others bitter, some confused, but none of them felt unfamiliar. They were echoes of a self that had not died, only retreated into quieter places. When she finished, she folded them again, tied them with a strip of linen, and held them to her chest. She sat like that for a long time, not praying, not mourning, but simply remembering. The following week, without quite deciding why, she wrote another letter. This one was different. It did not plead or ache. It described her day, the weather, the taste of the new bread recipe she had tried. It told him about the way the wind moved the lavender now, slower than before, almost as if in mourning. She placed a letter beneath the hearthstone with the others, then stood and brushed ash from her skirt. It became a new rhythm. Each week, one letter, sometimes brief, sometimes pages. She told him things she never spoke aloud to anyone else. The strange joy of watching a bird land on the windowsill, the memory of his hand brushing hers when they reached for the same plum, the feeling of her body beginning to ache in places she didn't yet want to admit were aging. At first, it was just a ritual, something quiet and contained. But then something changed. One evening, while tending the fire, she lifted a stone to place a new letter and found that the bundle was slightly disturbed. Not stolen, not gone, but misaligned, as if someone had read through them and placed them back with hurried care. She froze. Her breath caught in her throat, and her hand hovered in midair. The hearth was closed each night, the floor untouched by anyone else. Her father could barely bend to tie his boots. No one else came inside without her knowing. She waited, listening, but there was only the crackle of firewood and the soft tick of clock. The next week, she left the letter with a question. If you're real, if you've read these, leave something behind. She folded it, tucked it under the stone, and went to bed with her heart pounding. When she returned the next morning, nothing seemed different at first, but then she noticed it. A single sprig of dried lavender lay across the top of the bundle. Old, brittle, its color almost gray, but unmistakable. She hadn't placed it there. She hadn't touched the lavender grove since last summer. She held the sprig in her hands and stared at the hearth for a long time. There was no reason, no logic. The house was sealed, the letters untouched. No footprints in the dirt, no open windows. And yet, the lavender had not appeared by accident. Elira did not tell anyone. What could she have said that would not sound like madness or desperation? But something in her stirred again. Not hope, not quite, not yet, but a kind of trembling curiosity, like light returning to a room long closed. She began writing more often. She no longer placed the letters beneath the hearthstone each time. Some she left near the barn, others under the old tree at the grove. One, she tucked inside a book they had once read together, a volume of old tales with ink-stained pages and a drawing of a swallow etched on the cover. Days passed. Sometimes the letters remained where she left them. Other times they vanished. No one spoke of it. No one claimed them. But her heart beat differently now. Then came the dream, not like the others, not full of fog and faceless silence. This one was sharp, crystalline. She was standing in the grove, the lavender blooming wildly, brighter than any summer she remembered. And Callan was there, not broken or burned or bloodied, but standing whole, older, changed, but still him. He did not speak. He only looked at her with that quiet intensity she remembered, the one that always made her feel seen without having to explain herself. He reached out, touched her cheek, and pressed something into her hand. She woke gasping, her palm clenched so tightly that her fingernails left marks. She opened her hand slowly. There was nothing there, but when she rose, she found the hearth cold. The fire had burned out completely, though she had banked it the night before. She went to the hearthstone, lifted it, and found the newest letter missing. In its place was something small, wooden, and familiar, a carved swallow, worn smooth with time. The initials Yem burned into one wing. She sat down on the floor and began to cry. not with despair, not with joy, but with the unbearable relief of something breaking open inside her after years of being closed. Her love had not returned. Not yet, but neither had it died, and that, somehow, was enough to begin again. It was nearing dusk when she first saw him again, though afterward, Alira would never be able to say for certain whether she recognized him by sight or by something far older than the eyes, a feeling, a pull, the way a dream clings to the edges of the mind before fully waking. She had been kneeling in the garden, dirt under her fingernails, breath shallow with the quiet ache of tired limbs. The clouds were low that day, hanging like smoke across the tops of the trees, and the air carried the smell of something about to break. When the knock came, it was not urgent. It was gentle, uncertain. She stood slowly, wiped her palms on her apron, and walked to the door with no thought of who it might be. No part of her expected what she found. He stood there, rain-slicked and motionless, a figure of bone and shadow wrapped in a worn cloak that dripped water onto the stones. His face was half hidden beneath the hood, but the line of his jaw, the way he held his weight unevenly as though balancing pain in both legs and memory, those things were familiar. She stared at him, the quiet of her breath louder than the sound of wind in the trees. And he said only one word, her name, Alira. The sound of it was neither question nor declaration. It was as if the name had sat too long in his throat, and now he needed to let it go to breathe. She did not move. The earth seemed to tilt slightly under her feet, not in panic, but in recognition, as if some long-forgotten part of herself had turned toward him before the rest of her could follow. She saw the scar then, cutting across his right cheekbone in a pale, ragged line that had not been there before. His eyes were darker than she remembered, not in color but in depth, like wells filled too far and left untended. The silence stretched between them, fragile as frost on early spring grass, and she realized that she was gripping the doorframe so tightly her knuckles ached. She did not speak his name. Could not. Her voice was somewhere buried beneath the swell of disbelief, joy, suspicion, sorrow. Too many currents to choose from. Callan shifted slightly, his weight faltering. She saw then that he was not merely tired but hurt, his right leg dragging slightly. His hands trembled even though the cold had not yet set in deeply. He looked like a man who had walked too far for too long without once turning back. And perhaps he had. She stepped aside wordlessly, letting the door fall open in silent invitation. He did not thank her, but he did not hesitate either. He crossed the threshold with the slow, deliberate motion of someone used to pain and weariness, and as he passed her, she caught the smell of old leather, blood, and the dampness of endless roads. He did not look back. She closed the door behind him, turned, and found him standing awkwardly near the hearth, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. He looked at the fire as though he did not know whether he should sit beside it or expect to be burned. She watched him, still saying nothing, still trying to fit this man, this worn, unfamiliar ghost, into the memory of the boy she had loved beneath the lavender trees. For a moment, neither of them moved. The only sound in the room was the soft ticking of the mantel clock and the faint wheeze of wind slipping between the stones of the wall. "Do you want food?" she asked, the word sounding strange in her mouth, like she had borrowed someone else's voice. He did not answer, but his eyes flicked toward her, and she took it for a yes. She moved toward the hearth, mechanically pulling bread from the shelf, warming broth in a pan, slicing cheese without thinking. Her hands knew the tasks even as her mind drifted further from certainty. She felt the weight of every step, every movement, as though she were walking underwater. When she placed a bowl and plate on the table, Callan sat slowly, as if afraid the chair would collapse beneath him. He ate with small, careful bites, as though relearning the shape of food, pausing between each spoonful to steady his hand. She sat across from him, watching, her own hunger long forgotten. In the flickering firelight, the hollow under his cheekbones was sharp, his skin pale with a faint grayness, and his hair, once sun-burnished brown, had dulled to the color of weathered soil. But it was his eyes that unsettled her most, because they still held the same weight, the same quiet that once made her feel safe, though now that quiet was filled with ghosts. He did not speak again that night. When the meal was done, he nodded once, and she gestured toward the hayloft above the barn, where an old cot and wool blankets still waited from the time her uncle stayed one long winter ago. She handed him the key and watched as he limped out into the night, shoulders hunched not only against the cold but against the weight of having returned. She did not follow, did not ask where he had been or why it had taken 5 years. Not because she wasn't burning to know, but because she sensed that he had no words left for explanation. Whatever story lived behind his eyes was not ready to be told, and whatever pain had carried him home had not yet left his bones. In the days that followed, they circled each other like survivors from different ships that had wrecked on the same shore. Callan rose late, his steps heavy, his speech brief. He slept often, not in restful stretches but in jagged pieces, plagued by something that kept him from slipping too deeply into silence. Some nights she heard him cry out, not in fear, but in anger, as though some memory inside him refused to die quietly. She did not wake him. She simply stood outside the bar in the darkness, listening until the cries faded and the wind took their place. In the morning, he never spoke of them. He began helping where he could, stacking wood, feeding chickens, mending a broken fence post. But he moved slowly, and his strength gave out quickly. She saw the way he winced when lifting his arms above his head, the way his breath caught when he knelt too long. Once, she found him sitting on the stone step behind the barn, eyes closed, face turned to the sun with an expression that looked almost like shame. She did not interrupt. She carried water to him without speaking, set it beside him, and walked away. He drank an hour later. One evening, as they shelled peas beside the hearth, she asked, "Where did you go?" It was the first question, and it hung in the room like smoke, refusing to drift. He did not look at her. Instead, he stared at the fire, shelling another pod with slow fingers, and said, "South, then east." Then I stopped counting. He offered nothing more. She nodded, accepting the answer for what it was, a wall built not to deceive but to survive. Over time, fragments came, not in order, not with clarity, but scattered like leaves fallen from different trees. He had been wounded, left behind, taken in by a woman who nursed soldiers in secret, a widow with no children and too many ghosts of her own. He stayed hidden, limping, nameless, while others were rounded up and executed for desertion. Later, he wandered, village to village, country to country, never staying long enough to be found or remembered. "I didn't know who I was anymore," he said once, voice low and ragged. "So I didn't come back." And then, after a pause, it felt like a confession. "But I couldn't forget." Neither could she. Some evenings they sat in silence, each tending their own memory. Others, they spoke in small offerings. The color of the sky that morning, the way the goat had tried to eat a sock, the memory of a festival long ago when they'd stolen mulled wine and laughed until their stomachs hurt. Slowly, gently, they began to weave a new quiet between them, not the fragile hush of avoidance, but the tentative peace of people relearning how to be known. Still, she did not reach for him, and he did not ask for her hand. Whatever they had been before the war was not something that could be returned to like an old coat taken from the hook. Too much had unraveled, too much had changed, but there was something else, something deeper, a recognition, a shared silence, a knowing that came from having walked through different kind of fire and found, at last, the same ash-covered threshold. One night, she found him outside, staring at the sky, his coat wrapped tightly around his frame. "Do you ever wish you hadn't come back?" she asked, the words emerging before she could stop them. He turned to her slowly, the lines of his face softened by moonlight. "Every day," he said, "until I saw your door open." Then, after a long silence, he added, "Since then, not once." She stood beside him then, not touching, but close enough to feel the warmth of his breath in the cool night. And for the first time since he returned, she let herself believe that the person she had buried in her heart might not be a ghost after all, but something living, something changed, something still trying. And she was no longer the girl who waited. She was a woman who endured, who opened the door when the past came knocking, who chose each day to stay. The barn became his refuge, though he never called it that, and Alira never offered the word aloud. It was understood, unspoken. The hayloft, with its low rafters and thin shafts of light breaking through the wood slats, took on the quality of a hermit's cell. He spent long hours there, even during daylight, sitting cross-legged in the dust with his back against the wall, staring at the space in front of him as though it were filled with figures only he could see. She brought food at regular intervals and left it on the small table at the bottom of the ladder without calling up to him. Sometimes he ate, sometimes he didn't. When he did, the plates returned empty but neatly cleaned, the cutlery aligned just so, as if some part of him still remembered the discipline of routine, the quiet reverence of order. He did not speak much during this time, not in greeting, not in parting. His words had become fewer, pared down to the essentials of existence. Thank you, or yes, or I'm going out. Nothing else. And yet, somehow, she knew he was trying. There were days she caught him in motion across the yard, walking slowly with a limp that had settled into permanence, his right shoulder hunched inward as though his body were trying to fold in on itself. He would gather fallen branches or sit on the edge of the fence, watching the sky shift from one pale shade to another. She saw him press his hand to his chest once, not in pain, but as if steadying himself against something no longer there. She wondered, quietly, if he still dreamed of the battlefield, if his ears still heard the percussion of cannon fire, the final cries of boys who had once laughed under trees not unlike those that grew behind their home. She wondered if her name still echoed in that place, or if it had been buried under too much death to survive. Their conversations remained minimal, but gestures began to emerge between them, small rituals that carried more intimacy than speech. A cup left on the windowsill, filled with warm tea, always waiting after his long walks. A sprig of rosemary tucked beneath her kitchen knife, lay without fanfare but never without meaning. She began baking in the early mornings again, waking before the sun rose, filling the kitchen with the scent of rising dough and cinnamon. It had been years since she made bread, not for sustenance, but for comfort. She began kneading it the way her mother had shown her, slow, deliberate, with the weight of the heel of her palm pressed deep into the center, folding the air into the softness, breathing life into flour and salt. One morning, without asking, Callan joined her. He stood beside her in the kitchen, silent, his hands hovering uncertainly over the dough. She placed her flour-dusted fingers atop his, guiding him without words. His hands, though still rough, trembled less in hers than they had before. They kneaded side by side in a silence that felt sacred. Some days she found small carvings left in quiet corners. Tiny birds, curled leaves, smooth, faceless figures no taller than a thumb. He worked them from scrap wood, the kind left from fence repairs or storm-broken branches. She never saw him carving, never heard the scrape of the blade or the soft pat of shavings falling to the floor. But she found the pieces in places she would discover only by chance. In the drawer where she kept her aprons, on the windowsill beside the lavender vase, beneath the old stool in the garden shed. It was as though he was speaking through these objects, shaping the language he no longer trusted his voice to carry. Each carving was a message, and she read them slowly, learning him again not as the boy who had gone, but as the man who had returned. Still, a space lingered between them, not distance, not rejection, but memory. It hovered in the rooms they shared, a ghost that lived in the way they paused before touching, in the way their eyes flickered away just before contact. She caught him watching her sometimes, as though trying to remember something long forgotten. The curve of her cheek as she turned, the sound of her breath when she slept, and she, in turn, studied him in the quiet of her own solitude, noticing how he moved more softly now, how his voice held a gravity that had not been there before. There was still so much unspoken between them, questions left to rot in the unlit corners of 5 lost years. She wanted to ask him where he had gone, what had broken him, and what had held him together, but the words always withered on her tongue. She feared his answers, not because they might change what she felt, but because they might confirm what she already knew, that there were parts of him that would never return, no matter how long he stayed. One evening, near midsummer, he asked to walk with her to the lavender grove. It was the first time he had mentioned it since his return. Her heart clenched, but she did not let it show. She nodded, tied her shawl around her shoulders, and led him down the path without a word. The grove had grown wilder in the years since he left. The trees had twisted deeper into themselves, their trunks thick with moss, and the air carried the rich, bittersweet scent of bloom and decay. She had not stepped beneath those branches in months, perhaps longer. It felt strange to return with him, to walk once more beside the boy she had once kissed beneath those trees, now made stranger by time and silence. They stood beneath the rowan tree where the red ribbon had once hung. The branch that held it had broken long ago, splintered by wind and age, but the tree remained. Callan knelt slowly, placing a hand on the earth. She watched as his fingers sank into dirt, his eyes closing. The breeze stirred around them, and for a moment, it was as though the world held its breath. When he opened his eyes, they were wet but steady. "I thought about this place every day," he said. His voice cracked, not from tears, but from rust. "Every step I took, I imagined walking back here." Alira said nothing. She reached into her pocket and withdrew a new ribbon, deep red, the same shade as before. She tied it to a lower branch, the fabric catching the light, trembling slightly in the wind. It wasn't a restoration. It was a continuation, a marker of both loss and presence. He stood beside her, and for the first time his hand brushed hers. Not accidentally, not tentatively, just enough to be known. She let it stay. The following days were quieter, but changed. There was something soft in the way he moved, in the way he stood nearer to her, without bracing. He carved more, this time a box with tiny swallows etched into its lid. He gave it to her without ceremony, placing it on the table beside her teacup one morning and walking away before she could thank him. Inside the box was a single folded paper, a note with only one line. "For what you kept alive." She placed the box beside her bed. That night, as they sat near the fire, he told her about the worst night of the war. Not in full, but in flashes. The smell of burned bodies. The sound of a boy's voice calling for his mother as the sky turned red. How he had run, not toward the fighting, but away from it. How he had hidden in a crawl space beneath a collapsed church, lying still for 3 days with the corpse of another soldier pressed against his leg. How he had heard his name called by enemies, allies, ghosts. How he had stopped answering. She listened without interrupting, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the shadows dancing along the wall. When he finished, he looked at her, eyes hollow but present. "I wasn't brave," he said. "I just survived. I don't know what that makes me." She reached out then, touched his hand with hers, and said, "It makes you here." And in that moment, something between them shifted, not healed, not erased, but transformed. Grief did not leave them. Memory did not grow easier. But the distance began to lessen, not all at once, not forever, but enough. Enough to stay, enough to begin, enough to be known again, not as what they had once been, but as who they had become. It was during the slow, yellowing days of early autumn that the names began to appear. At first, they arrived as idle gestures, marks of habit more than purpose. Callan would sit outside near the barn during the later hours of the day, the light softened by the slant of season, a small knife balanced in one callous hand and a plank of pale wood in the other. Alira would glance out from the window while washing dishes or feeding the hens and see him there, hunched slightly, sleeves rolled to the elbow, his movements precise but strangely reverent. She thought at first he was whittling another carving, perhaps another bird or leaf or faceless figure. But when she drew near one day, bringing him a cup of warm cider, without announcing her approach, she noticed the unmistakable curves of letters being pressed into the grain. Names, not etched with artistry or flourish, but carved with clean, direct strokes. She did not speak. She simply handed him the cider and let her eyes rest briefly on the word he had just finished. Jolin. The wood beneath it had darkened from his grip, and beside it were 4 other names she did not recognize. That night, she found the plank leaned against the barn wall, tucked beneath the eaves where the rain couldn't touch it. She knelt and traced the names with her fingers, their edges still rough, the shavings curled like lashes in the grass. Each name carried a weight beyond the wood, an invisible thread stretching back to a moment, a voice, a breath now silenced. She did not ask who they were. She didn't need to. They were the ones who had walked with him into war and had not walked out, the ones he still carried, even as his own name had nearly been erased by silence. When she stood and stepped back, she saw that another plank had already been propped beside the first. Blank, waiting, By the end of the week, there were 7. Callan did not explain them. He did not name them aloud or tell their stories. But Alira began to understand that this was his way of grieving, of remembering, a language of names carved into what the world had forgotten. She began to help him gather the wood, quiet lengths of pine and maple, whatever they could spare from a fire pile or salvage from old fence rails. She would leave them near the edge of the barn without a word, and by morning they would bear the weight of another name. Sometimes she watched him from a distance, studying the slow bow of his back as he bent over the wood, the steady line of his jaw as he focused, the way his lips moved slightly as if sounding the names without breath. It was a kind of prayer, she realized, not to a god, perhaps, but to memory itself, to the fragile, fleeting dignity of being remembered. It made her chest ache in ways she could not describe, as if something inside her was being asked to make space for sorrow not her own. And yet, in that act, she felt closer to him than she had since his return, not because he was speaking to her, but because he was finally speaking to someone, even if it was only to the dead. On the 10th evening, she followed him as he carried the carved planks into the orchard behind the barn, a quiet place where the trees grew in uneven rows and the earth softened with the weight of moss and fallen fruit. He did not acknowledge her presence, but he did not stop her either. She watched as he knelt and began to press each plank into the earth, not as markers but as offerings. There were no stones, no crosses, no names said aloud. Only the rustle of wind through branches and the rhythmic sound of hands placing memory into soil. When he finished, he sat back on his heels and rested his hands in his lap. The air around him seemed thinner, as though something had been lifted, not gone, but shared. That night, he returned to the cottage without speaking, and Alira poured him a cup of broth and sat beside him as he drank it slowly. They did not speak of the names. They did not speak of the orchard. But as the fire settled into embers in the sky, outside dimmed into blue-gray silence, she reached for his hand. He let her hold it. His fingers were cold and calloused, and for a long moment, he did not grip back. But then, with a trembling barely perceptible, he laced his fingers through hers, and that, she knew, was his way of letting her in. Over the next few weeks, the ritual deepened. Callan carved fewer names each day, not because he was forgetting, but because he was remembering more slowly, more deliberately. He began to pause between each plank, sometimes staring at the wood for hours before beginning. Alira noticed that the newer names were carved with greater care, the letters cleaner, the spacing wider. They had become not just memorials but stories, distilled into symbols, shapes, patterns that only he could read. Sometimes, after carving, he would sit on the back step and hum quietly to himself. She had never known him to sing before the war. His voice was low and tuneless, more vibration than melody, but it filled the air like something being returned. One morning, while hanging laundry, Alira found him sitting near the orchard with his back to the trees, a plank resting on his knees. But this time there was no name on it. Instead, he had begun carving a swallow, its wings spread mid-flight, the lines delicate and incomplete. She approached slowly, the laundry forgotten in her arms, and stopped a few steps away. "It's not a name," she said softly. He looked up, blinking against the sunlight, and nodded. "No," he replied, voice hoarse. "This one's for the ones I couldn't name, the ones I didn't know." She sat beside him in the grass, setting the basket aside, and watched as he traced the outline of the bird with the tip of his blade. "Do you think they'll know?" she asked. He paused, eyes fixed on the curve of the wing. "I hope so." There was something in the way he said it, tired, but not defeated. Grief had carved him as surely as he had carved those planks. But it had not taken everything. Some part of him still sought beauty, still believed in gesture, in remembrance, in the quiet holiness of creating something with the hands. Alira found herself breathing more easily in that moment, as if his sorrow had begun to settle not into a wound, but into soil. Later that afternoon, she brought him an old journal she had found in the bottom drawer of her mother's cabinet. Its pages were blank, the cover worn but intact, its binding stitched with red thread. "For the names you can't carve," she said, offering it without explanation. He took it with both hands, opened it carefully, and nodded. He did not write in it right away. He kept it beside his cot in the barn, and she often saw him thumbing through the empty pages. as if waiting for the right moment to let them begin. The journal marked a shift between them. Their conversations grew more steady, the silences less fraught. He began helping her in the kitchen again, this time offering suggestions, remembering how his mother used to bake barley cakes with rosemary, how his sister would always steal the crust from the corner of the pie. These memories arrived unbidden, often mid-task, and they stayed longer than before. He told her once, while peeling apples, about a man named Harold who used to play songs on a harmonica by the fire. He laughed softly at the memory. He was terrible at it, he said, but it was the only thing that made the nights bearable. It was the first time she had heard him laugh since his return. As the season turned, the orchard filled with the scent of ripe apples and drying leaves. The planks remained in place, untouched by anyone but the wind. Elira sometimes walked among them, tracing the names with her fingertips, learning them as one learns a second language, slowly, reverently, unsure of pronunciation but certain of meaning. She began adding flowers near their bases, small bundles of sage or lavender, tokens of a woman who could not speak to the dead but could offer beauty to their memory. One evening, she found Callan beneath the rowan tree again, a small bundle of wood in his lap, another name pressed halfway into the grain. He looked up as she approached, and instead of closing the plank or turning away, he held it out to her. His name was Kellen, he said. He had a daughter, wrote her letters every week until he couldn't. I promised I'd remember him. She took the plank, her fingers trembling slightly, and traced the letters. "Now I will too," she whispered. In that moment, something shifted between them, not in speech, but in knowing. Grief had brought him back. Memory had rooted him here. But it was shared remembrance, this act of holding the weight of the loss together, that tethered them finally, not as people trying to return to what once was, but as two souls building something new from the pieces that remained. And in the orchard, under the fading light, with names stitched into the wood and silence stitched between them, they stood not in mourning, but in a quiet kind of grace. It was a spring of soft rains, the kind that did not arrive with thunder or warning, but settled into the soil as though they belonged there, slipping down the thatched roof in delicate streams and darkening the wood of the shutters to the color of river stone. The garden flourished under this tender weather, and so did something between Elira and Callan, though neither of them gave a name. It was not a return to what they had once been, but the slow emergence of something different, quieter, more tentative, like the first green pushing through winter-thick ground. There was no declaration, no sudden confession, just a deepening day by day as they moved in closer orbits around one another, not colliding but circling with the patience of people who had learned, through absence, the cost of moving too fast. Mornings began to take on a new shape. Callan would rise earlier than before, often before the sun fully crested the hills, and Elira would find him already at work, sleeves rolled, hands covered in dirt or flour or ash depending on the day. He began helping her with the bread again, but not like the first time when his hands had trembled and hers had guided. Now, they worked side by side in natural rhythm, her hands pressing the dough into the bowl while his added the water and salt, the two of them moving in quiet harmony, without need for instruction. He had grown steadier, more present. His hands, though still scarred, no longer hesitated. She watched him grow back into his body, into the man he might have become if the war had not torn him from himself. And in doing so, she began to allow herself to reach, gently, into the life they were making together. There were still hard days. The rain, while kind to the garden, seemed to stir old hurts in Callan's bones, especially his leg, which would ache so deeply that some nights he could barely stand. He would sit by the fire then, jaw clenched, eyes closed, breathing through the pain without complaint. Elira did not fuss over him. She simply brought him hot cloths and tea, her presence quiet and steady, a kind of answer to his suffering that required no words. Sometimes he would reach for her hand in those moments, not asking for anything, just needing to know she was there. And she was, always. One evening, after a long day of planting herbs and repairing the fence near the eastern orchard, Callan brought out a small wooden box that he had been working on in secret. He placed it in her lap without introduction, his hands still streaked with sap and soil. The lid was carved with a pattern of swallows in flight, and around the edge, small vines twisted into shapes she recognized from the hills where they once lay together as young lovers. Inside, she found a length of soft linen and 3 flat stones, each inscribed with symbol, a tree, a star, a flame. She looked up at him, waiting for explanation, but he only shrugged slightly and said, "For the things we don't forget, for what roots us, for what still burns." She understood. The tree for her mother, for the years she had spent kneeling at that bedside, singing through her own tears. The star for the boy he once was, the one who carved birds and whispered promises he was never given a chance to keep. And the flame for the part of them that survived all of it, stubborn and quiet, refusing to be extinguished. She kept the box by her bedside after that, resting her fingers on the lid each night before she slept, as though grounding herself in memory before surrendering to dreams. As the weather warmed, Alira began to sing again, not often and not loudly, but in fragments, little melodies from her childhood, songs her mother had hummed while tending the garden, or lullabies passed down in the old tongue. The first time she caught herself doing it, she froze, embarrassed by the suddenness of it. But when she glanced up, Callan was watching her with a look she couldn't name, something fragile and wide-eyed. He didn't say anything, just nodded once and returned to his work, and something within her eased. After that, she let the songs come more freely. They became a kind of tether between them, a sound that reminded them both they were alive, and that life, even in its quietness, still had music in it. Sometimes he would hum along, though he never remembered the words. His voice had grown rougher over the years, but it carried a depth now, a kind of rootedness that Alira found oddly beautiful. One night, as they sat by the fire shelling peas, he began to hum the tune of a midsummer song she hadn't heard since before the war, and when she looked up, he was smiling in that small, lopsided way that had once been a secret. "My mother used to sing that," he said, voice low. "She said it would keep the storms away." Alira didn't answer. She just kept singing, softer now, like a prayer folded in sound. Their intimacy deepened in gestures, not in speech. When she braided her hair, he would hand her the comb before she reached for it. When he winced while rising from the bench, she would wordlessly bring the balm she kept on the mantel. He began leaving notes in strange places, small pieces of parchment folded inside the flower jar, tucked beneath her sewing basket, once even slipped between the pages of the worn poetry book she read before bed. They weren't letters, not really, just sentences, half-thoughts, observations. "The trees sound different this morning. I dreamed you were laughing. I'm still here." Each note was written in a hand that trembled slightly but grew more certain over time. She kept every one of them in a drawer, and on days when the sky felt too heavy, she would take them out and read them like scripture. But still, neither of them spoke of love, not as they had known it, not as a promise. It was there, beneath everything, like water beneath stone, shaping the landscape without ever rising above it. Sometimes she wondered if it needed to be named at all. Maybe what they were building together could survive better in silence, untroubled by the weight of definition. But one evening, after a rain that soaked the earth until it gleamed silver in the moonlight, Callan came to her with something new in his eyes. They had been sitting on the porch, the air thick with the smell of wet bark and honeysuckle, when he said, "I don't know how to ask you for anything. I don't know what I have to offer, but I want to stay. If you'll let me." She didn't answer right away. She reached for his hand, curled her fingers into his, and leaned her head on his shoulder. The quiet between them held all the yes she could not find in words. After a while, he whispered, "I used to think I was a ghost, that I had come back wrong. But you make me feel like I'm real again." "You are," she said. "You always were. You just forgot for a while." In the weeks that followed, they moved into a rhythm that felt less like healing and more like becoming. They repaired the shed, tended the garden, read to each other in the evenings. She taught him the names of herbs again, and he showed her how to sand a beam smooth without splinters. Some days were still difficult. Grief did not vanish just because love had returned. There were mornings he woke with panic in his eyes, sweat across his brow, And there were days she felt the old ache of waiting resurface, a phantom pain from the years she stood at the window, watching a road that never yielded footsteps. But now they had each other to turn toward. When one bent, the other steadied. When one faltered, the other waited. And in this way, they built something not out of what they had lost, but out of what they were willing to share, today and the day after and whatever time would follow. One morning, as they stood at the edge of the orchard, watching the new shoots curl upward from the soil, Alira said, "I never thought I'd know joy again." Callan looked at her, quiet, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. "I didn't think I deserved it." She smiled, reached out and took his hand. "Then let's grow it carefully, together." And so they did, not with haste, not with certainty, but with the steadiness of people who had walked through ruin and come out carrying seeds. The storm came without thunder. It arrived with a wind too warm for the season, pressing to the valley like breath held too long, heavy with the scent of distant fires and the whisper of unfinished business. The air shifted days before, though neither Alira nor Callan could say how they first noticed. The chickens grew restless, pacing and flapping without cause. The cat refused to settle by the hearth, choosing instead to linger beneath the barn rafters, watching the door with unblinking suspicion. Even the trees seemed to lean differently, their branches drawn inward like bodies bracing against something unseen. Alira felt it in her chest, a tautness, the way she once did before her mother's worst fevers, that hush of waiting wrapped in dread. It was late afternoon when the riders came. Two of them, cloaked in ash-colored coats, mud-caked to the knees, the insignia of the Southern Command stitched like a wound onto their sleeves. They did not gallop. They moved slowly, deliberately, as if the mere act of arriving was enough to draw lines in the earth. Alira saw them first from the field, her hands deep in a patch of nettles she had been clearing for new planting. She froze, dirt clinging to her palms, and watched as the riders dismounted in front of the cottage with the careful indifference of men who had done this many times before. Callan had been in the barn mending a cracked trough, and she had not called out to him. Instead, she stood there, the nettle burning her skin, her breath caught between her ribs, and waited to see what memory would become. The taller of the two knocked on the door with the back of his hand, a gesture too familiar to be polite. When no one answered, he turned to the barn. Alira moved then, not with haste but with resolve, wiping her hands on her skirt as she crossed the field. By the time she reached them, the man had already opened the barn door, calling out in a voice meant not for greeting, but for summoning. Callan stepped into the light slowly, eyes narrowed, the hammer still in his grip. His sleeves were rolled, revealing the pale scars that ran like vines across his forearms, the marks he never spoke of, and that Alira had only traced once with her fingers in the dark. When he saw the men, he did not flinch. He simply lowered the hammer to the work table and straightened his back. "Name," the taller one demanded, though there was no question in his tone. Callan did not answer, not immediately. His eyes met Alira's across the space between them, and something passed between them, warning, sorrow, and something like resolve. Then he turned back to the men and said quietly, "You know it already." The second soldier stepped forward. He was younger, more nervous, his eyes darting around the barn as though expecting it to be filled with more men, with hidden weapons, with some threat that might justify the way his hand lingered near his belt. "Deserters are still being accounted for," he said, not unkindly, but with the practiced rhythm of someone reading from a list that had grown too long. "If you're harboring under false identity, you need to surrender yourself now. If you resist, we are authorized." "I'm not resisting," Callan said, his voice low, almost tired. "I'm here. I've been here. I left the war. That's true, but I didn't run. I just didn't go back." Alira wanted to step between them. Her body itched with a need to protect, to defend, but she knew instinct would do little here. These men were not interested in stories, in redemption, in the thousand quiet ways a person could die and still return. They had come for clarity, and war had never made room for anything more complex than obedience. "You understand the penalty," the younger one said. "I understand what I left behind," Callan replied, "and I understand what I've lived through since." The older man looked past him then, his eyes falling on the stack of carved planks leaning against the back wall. Alira saw his gaze rest on the etched names, The familiar pattern of memory turned into wood. "Those yours?" he asked. Callan nodded. The man tilted his head. "Unreadable. You keep track of them?" "They were my brothers," Callan said. "I didn't want them lost." For a moment, the barn held its breath. No one moved. Outside, the wind stirred the dry leaves against the doorframe. Then the older soldier stepped back. "We'll return tomorrow," he said. "There's a captain in the next town. He'll want to speak with you. Make your case." He didn't say what would happen if that case failed. He didn't need to. The shape of it already hung in the air. After they left, Alira stood beside Callan in the quiet. He didn't sit. He didn't speak. He just stared at the empty doorway as if waiting for something else to follow. She wanted to scream, wanted to run into the field and burn every record that had ever borne his name. But instead, she reached for his hand. His fingers were shaking. "I should have told you they might come," he said. "You didn't need to," she replied. "I've been waiting since the day you came home." That night, they did not sleep. The fire burned low, and they sat close beside it, their shoulders touching, but no words passing between them. The fear was too large to name. Alira thought of all the letters she had written, the prayers folded into ash, the years she had spent with nothing but silence as answer. And now that he was here, truly here, the idea of losing him again did not feel like grief. It felt like being hollowed from the inside, like someone reaching into her chest and scooping out everything she had spent years learning to rebuild. Callan finally spoke near dawn. "If I go, I won't come back." "No," she said, her voice even. "You won't." He looked at her then, really looked, his eyes red-rimmed but unflinching. "I didn't run to save myself. I ran because I couldn't watch them die anymore, because I had forgotten what it meant to be human. When I came back, I didn't know if I still was." "You are," she said. "You've proved it every day since." He reached for her, his hand against her cheek, and for the first time since his return, he wept. Not the soundless kind he'd given to the night, but a full, body-racking sob that left him folded against her, breathless. She held him as if she could hold back the morning, as if arms alone could make time change its course. But dawn came anyway, and with it, the weight of decision. By midday, the soldiers returned to the captain, a woman with sharp eyes and a voice like cracked stone. She asked her questions with efficiency, pressing Callan for dates, for locations, for details Alira knew had long since blurred in his mind. He answered what he could. He did not beg. He did not deny. He simply offered what he had, shaped by the scars he still carried and the names he refused to forget. When the questioning ended, the captain was silent for a long time. Then she turned to Alira and said, "You vouch for him?" "I live beside him," Alira replied. "I breathe because he came home." The captain studied her, then looked at Callan once more. "The war's over," she said. "But peace is a cost, too. We'll review this. Don't leave the district." They left without ceremony. No chains, no papers, just a warning that nothing was yet decided. That evening, Callan sat by the orchard, a blank plank of wood in his lap. He didn't carve a name. He carved a doorway, its edges rough, the space inside empty. Alira sat beside him, watching. "What's it for?" she asked. "For what comes next," he said. "Whatever it is." And in that moment, they were no longer living the shadow of what had been. They were facing the unknown, still together, still trembling, but no longer silent. The Lavender Grove had always been a place of memory, but now, after everything, it had become something more, a place of reckoning. The sky was pale that morning, the kind of soft, cloud veil hue that turned the world to pearl. The hills glistened faintly from a recent rain, the soil dark and tender beneath Alira's boots as she made her way alone down the path she once swore she'd never walk again. She carried the ribbon in her pocket, fingers pressed to the folded cloth as if to ground herself, as if the weight of fabric could steady what shook inside her. It had been 5 days since the captain left. 5 days of waiting in a silence so taut it rang like wire. 5 days of half-heard footsteps that never came in a world teetering between threat and reprieve. Callan had spent most of that time in the barn, not carving, not writing, simply sitting, watching the door. watching the road. Elira could not reach him during those hours. His body was beside her, but his spirit had curled inward, drawn tight around the knot of uncertainty that neither of them had the power to undo. She had not told him where she was going. She hadn't needed to. He knew where she would be. The grove had always been the tether between them, the living archive of what they had once dared to believe in. And now, even after all the years and silence and scars, she needed it to bear witness to something new. When she stepped beneath the arch of branches, the scent of the lavender hit her like a memory coming back too fast. It had bloomed early this year, wild and untamed, spreading in a thick patchwork of purple that reached as high as her knees in some places. The ground was softer than she remembered, damp with promise, and as she walked deeper into the grove, her fingers brushed against the blossoms, drawing the scent up into her skin like a baptism. She reached the rowan tree where the ribbon had once lived. Where it had fluttered in the breeze a day, she first kissed a boy who would grow into a man broken by war and remade by survival. The branch that had snapped was now healed over, a jagged scar of new bark forming where the old had torn. She stood before it and pulled the ribbon from her pocket. Red, deep and dark like old wine, the color of something that had burned and been born again. It was not the same one, of course. That had long since vanished. But this one had come from her mother's old sewing basket, found among scraps of lace and thread, a piece of the past waiting for new purpose. She tied it slowly, wrapping it twice, her fingers steady despite the tremor inside her chest. When it was done, she stepped back and looked at it for a long while. The breeze caught it gently, and it danced like a flame against the green. She knelt then, pressing her hands into the earth, her palms sinking into the soil until they were covered in dirt. She whispered a prayer, not to a god, but to the memory of herself, to the girl who had once knelt here with a heart wide open and a future so full of light it had nearly blinded her. She told that girl that she had made it, not unbroken but alive. She told her that the boy had returned, that he had stood on her doorstep and asked to be let in, and that she had done so not with fear, but with the same quiet courage that had carried her through his absence. She whispered all the names of the ones who hadn't come back, letting their memory pass through her like wind through leaves, and she asked the earth to remember them too. She stayed there until the sun crested the hill and spilled gold across the grove, until the warmth soaked through the thin fabric of her sleeves and settled against her spine. She stayed until her knees ached and the wind had quieted, and then, only then, did she hear the footsteps behind her. She did not turn immediately. She knew who it was. The air shifted when he was near, not with sound, but with weight, with the particular stillness that he carried like a shadow. She felt him stop beside her, and for a while, neither of them spoke. He knelt too, his hands resting on his thighs, and they sat together like that, side by side beneath the tree, their bodies close enough to touch but not yet daring to. "You came," he said finally, voice rough. "I had to," she replied. "This place remembers us." He looked at the ribbon then, and his eyes softened. "You tied it again." "I needed to," she said, "not to bring you back. You're already here. But for me, for the part of me that forgot how to hope." He didn't speak for a long time. She thought he might not at all. But then he reached into his coat and pulled out something small, a charm of sorts, carved from wood, shaped like a bird mid-flight. He placed it at the base of the tree, beside her hands. "I made this the night I left for the war," he said. "I never finished it. I was going to give it to you when I came home." He paused. "I didn't think I'd ever get the chance." She touched the carving with her fingertips, tracing the lines where the wood had been smoothed and reshaped, where time and return had finished what fear had once interrupted. "You still can," she said. "I don't know how to be who I was," he confessed, voice cracking slightly. "I don't think I can love the way I used to." Elira turned to him then, met his gaze fully for the first time that day. "I don't want who you were," she said. "I want who you are now, the man who came back, the man who remembers, the man who stays." His eyes brimmed with something unshed, and he reached for her hand. This time, she let him take it. His palm was rough, scarred, but warm. The silence between them deepened into something that felt less like absence and more like belonging. As the sun moved higher, they stood together and walked slowly through the grove, their hands entwined. They did not speak of the visit from the soldiers, nor of the captain's warning. They did not mention the uncertainty that still hung like mist at the edges of their days. Instead, they spoke of the garden, what still needed planting, which herbs had begun to sprout. They spoke of the goats, how the oldest had begun sleeping on the barn steps again, how the youngest had managed to chew through the rope for the third time that week. These were the conversations of ordinary life, of shared breath and shared hours, and they carried with them more comfort than any vow. When they reached the far end of the grove, where the lavender grew wildest, Callan stopped and turned toward her. "This place," he said, "it never stopped growing, even when we did." "No," Alira replied, "it didn't, and neither did we. We just forgot for a while." He nodded, and she saw in his face something she hadn't dared hope for. Not joy, not quite, but peace. A settling, a softening, a readiness. They stood there a little longer. The scent of lavender thick in the air, the wind lifting the ribbon behind them like a banner not of mourning, but of return. Later, back at the cottage, they sat on the porch as dusk gathered in folds across the hills. The sky turned rose-colored, then indigo, then deep blue as stars began to surface like old truths rising from a long-forgotten place. Callan pulled the blanket around her shoulders, his arm remaining there, holding her not tightly but steadily. She leaned into him and closed her eyes. "I used to think coming home was the end of something," he murmured. "Now I think it might be the beginning." "It is," she said, "the beginning of whatever we choose to make of it." And as night settled around them, full and hushed, the ribbon fluttered in the grove behind them, and the door to their life, unfinished, imperfect, and fiercely lived, remained open. The years passed slowly, then all at once, the way they always do when sorrow begins to ease its grip in life, in all its quiet insistence, returns to take root where grief once lived. Seasons moved in their slow, relentless rhythm, and Alira learned to greet them not as reminders of what had been lost, but as companions in what was still growing. The lavender grove bloomed each summer with greater abundance, its scent drifting across the cottage fields and drawing bees and travelers alike. The orchard behind the barn, where Callan had carved names into wood and planted memory into soil, grew wilder with time, but never untended. Each spring, they cleared the fallen leaves and whispered to the trees as they worked, thanking them for holding what they could no longer carry. The carved planks weathered beneath the rain and sun, the names softened by moss and time, but never forgotten. They remained a chorus of the past, rooted in a land that now held a different kind of peace. Callan did not speak often of the war after that first season, but his silence no longer bore the shape of pain. It had become a kind of reverence, a way of honoring what had shaped him without allowing it to consume the man he was still becoming. He walked with a limp that deepened as the years went on, but Alira never once saw him falter in spirit. He rose early, split wood with deliberate care, taught the neighbor's boy how to mend a broken gate, and let the child watch as he carved birds from leftover pine. His hands, though slower, remained steady. His eyes, once hollowed by memory, filled again with light, gentle, discerning, the eyes of someone who had seen the worst of the world and still chose, daily, to believe in its tender, unfinished beauty. Alira, too, found herself transformed in ways she could not have foreseen. She began to write again, not letters to the dead, but stories of the living. She chronicled the recipes her mother had passed down in murmurs, the names of flowers that bloomed only after the third frost, the way the light bent across the hills just before rain. Her journal grew thick with pages, and in the evenings, she would read aloud to Callan as he smoked his pipe beside the fire, his eyes closed but listening with the patience of someone who no longer feared what the future might bring. She spoke of her dreams too, though more cautiously, of places she might never visit, of faces she imagined in the shape of clouds, of the children she had once longed for but no longer mourned. Their life together was quiet, but it was not small. It filled every corner of the cottage with breath and meaning. They never married. It was not a decision made in protest or delay, but simply one of quiet understanding. Theirs was a bond that already survived all the tests of absence and return. There was no need to mark it with ceremony. Instead, they carried their promises in daily acts. In the way she laid a second cup each morning, even when he rose late. In the way he fixed a hinge on her sewing box before she asked. In the long walks they took to grow without speaking, their steps falling into a rhythm that required no agreement. Love, they had learned, was not the fire that burned through a single night, but the warmth that returned each morning with the sun, persistent and unassuming. As word of peace spread and the edges of the kingdom slowly began to mend, more travelers came through their village. Some stayed a night. Others lingered longer, drawn by the bread Alira baked in the early mornings or by the stories they had heard of the orchard with names carved in wood. No one asked for explanations. The visitors simply came and sat, sometimes leaving behind trinkets or coins, sometimes only their silence. And the door remained open, always. It became known, quietly and without declaration, that the cottage on the hill was a place where the weary might rest, where no question was asked of those who arrived with nothing but the weight of their own living. Alira and Callan never turned anyone away. One spring, a girl came who reminded Alira of herself. She was too thin, her boots worn to the sole, and her eyes carried the same look Alira had once worn in the weeks after the letter had arrived. She said her brother had not returned, that her mother had died waiting, and that she had nowhere else to go. Alira made her tea and did not speak until the girl had slept a full day without waking. Then, in the lavender grove, she handed her the ribbon from the rowan tree. "Tie this where you need to," she said. "The earth remembers what we plant in it." The girl did not speak, but tears fell from her lashes, silent and clean, and Alira knew she understood. Over time, the home filled with small tokens, carvings from Callan's hands, bundles of dried herbs, letters left on the mantel from those who had passed through. Alira strung them on the walls, tied them to branches, tucked them into corners where they might offer quiet comfort to anyone who entered. The cottage itself seemed to change in response, becoming a vessel for memory and renewal, both sanctuary and story. Even the air within it held a kind of softness, as though the walls themselves had learned to breathe with compassion. When Callan grew older and the pain in his leg became too great to ignore, Alira would rise early and prepare the salves before he asked. He never complained, but she could see the toll in the way he winced when he stood or sat too long. Still he carved, slower now, but with a deepening care. One winter, he completed a new set of planks, names of those who had passed through their home and left something behind, even if only a smile or a scar. He planted them beside the orchard, the two rows now growing into a quiet memorial not only of war, but of healing. On the night Callan died, the fire was burning low, and the moon was high over the hills. He had been sitting in his chair, the carved box of swallows in his lap, his journal beside him. Alira found him with his head tilted slightly, his breath already gone, but his face at peace. She did not cry at first. She sat beside him and took his hand, still warm, and whispered a lullaby into the hush of the room, the same one her mother had once sung as the lavender bloomed in the fields. She stayed with him until morning, her hand wrapped in his, and when the first light filtered through the window, she closed his eyes and kissed his forehead. Then she walked the grove and tied a new ribbon to the tree, this one golden, like the light that always returned, no matter how long the darkness stayed. In the months that followed, Alira kept the door open. She baked bread each morning, fed the chickens, wrote in her journal. She did not try to fill the silence Callan had left behind. She let it settle, let it echo, let it speak for itself. She began to teach the neighbors' children how to tend herbs, how to listen to the earth, how to shape stories from the lives they lived. The girl who once arrived with nothing returned every season now, bringing seeds and letters and stories of her own. Together, they sat in the orchard and tended to names, repainting the ones worn by wind, planting wildflowers at their base. And always, Alira walked the path to the grove. Some days, she sat beside the tree in silence. Other days, she spoke to him, not with sorrow, but with presence. "You stayed," she would say. "You came home and you stayed." And that, in the end, was the story she told when others asked about love, not of grand gestures or perfect promises, but of the man who walked back from death with nothing in his hands but memory, and of the woman who opened her door and let him in. So when Alira, many years later, closed her own eyes for the last time, the cottage did not fall silent. The wind still moved through the trees. The lavender still bloomed. The door remained open, And the grove, rooted in grief, grown through love, stood as witness to it all.